Well, good morning to you. It's Sunday morning, Super Bowl Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. I find it's funny that I'm such a creature of habit that even this recording that I'm doing before I go to my conference this afternoon, I start at 8. How weird. Humans love ruts. Okay, this is going to be the second part of chapter 25. Cooper, my dog, is going to join me this morning, so I don't feel like I'm talking completely into cyberspace. He may interject or try to attempt to answer questions. He won't type them in, though. Very difficult for an animal missing thumbs to type, right? No space bar. So I will. He'll ask me questions sitting behind me, and then I will answer them. Okay. So it'd be like a student, a virtual student. I don't know if you can see his picture. That's what we call the Cooper eye. This is when he's looking at you, giving that like, you're getting ready to take me to the vet. You're getting ready to give me a bath. All right. Let's step back for just a second, just to kind of give an overall, and then we'll go back into the details where we were when we left off. I did want to go back and just kind of briefly again go over this idea of biogenesis, where life came from. Now, I want you to keep in mind, you guys are sophisticated science students by this point. You're very familiar with the scientific method. You're comfortable with hypotheses and theories and how they work and how all of that works. And no doubt when you look at this, or if you read it in your book and listen to the lecture, you realize that these are very broad brushed events, right? These are very, if the event isn't broad brushed, then the the leading up, one leading to two and two leading to three, and how we talked about it the other day. You got to keep in mind that certainly a lot of the details are missing. And no doubt in your lifetime or my lifetime, they might change quite a bit of this. But what we're saying as scientists is at this particular point, with no other evidence to suggest otherwise, and to be honest, relatively little evidence to suggest it's truthful, or excuse me, that it's correct. In other words, we can't discount these hypotheses. They seem reasonable. Spontaneous generation, which Pasteur, right? He was the fellow with the swan-necked thing. He disproved that non-life comes from, or life comes from non-life, that non-living things like meat don't create the maggots, that obviously it's the flies that get there and lay their eggs on the meat, and the egg hatches into the larvae. That's what's eating. They're obviously for eating the meat. And of course, you understand with evolution, right? The larvae getting food from the meat. With evolution, you understand that that's what a wonderful, great adaptation for that fly. I'm going to drop off my eggs. I'm not going to care what happened to them. Now, I'm going to lay a lot of them, right, to make sure that numbers game plays. But guess what? If one of those eggs, if let's say a bunch of flies in a population were dropping their eggs off everywhere, up, on the ground, on rocks, and this one just by happened dropped it on the meat. Okay, guess whose flies are going to do better? And then, of course, you know what doing better means, right? More fit. But we know that the maggots did have an origination, just like Pasteur in his experiment showed at the very end when he broke off the top, that again, providing more evidence to support his idea or more evidence to refute spontaneous generation. So again, back to those four things that happened in the biogenesis. We aren't saying that's exactly the way it happened. It just seems right now, based on what we know, those are all reasonable explanations, in spite of the fact they might be lacking a lot of detail, right? So there's the Miller-Urey thing where the organic molecules form. Now, we've been able to do that, okay? Is this how it happened on Earth? Maybe. Did it happen in the atmosphere? Maybe. Did it happen down around those geothermal vents? Maybe. Was it extraterrestrial? We found amino acids on asteroids, or evidence of amino acids on other planet or Earth, non-Earth planetary bodies, okay? And while amino acids aren't alive, you do remember from Bio 1 that they're getting close, right? Because life is organization, metabolism, and all that. Certainly amino acids are organized, okay? So we can do the amino acid thing. If you got enough energy, you can make monomers into polymers, right? Lots of volcanic activity on the early Earth, lots of warm places. You start packaging those reactions together, and you increase the chance they come into contact with one another. So this protocell is a reasonable next step to assume may have happened, right? Some sort of abiotically, remember, it's got to be abiotically produced. Abiotically means these protocells are collections of molecules that weren't produced by something life. This was chemistry. This is, to me, one of the breathtaking things. You're looking at this, and again, I understand a lot of the details, Miss, but you're going, wow, is this one of the things in which we went from chemistry, which is not alive, to alive? You know, is this where this process occurs, or at least part of the process? But what they're basically saying here is if you get these abiotically produced molecules, throw in a few things, okay, you got to prime the pump, you know, but as we learned at the end of this, there were proteins being made. There were even, remember, there even was a hereditary molecule. It wasn't DNA, it was RNA. So maybe those enzymes could have occurred. But in the labs, if you throw that, you get some very, very basic metabolism. Very, very intriguing when you look at that, right? So we got this package of things that's actually carrying out a process. Volcanic ash. Volcanic ash promotes the formation of those protocells. And as I said, it wasn't DNA, but RNA, the last part, a self-replicating molecule. Again, those broad ideas of what must have happened for this whole idea of life is finally perpetuation. Something carries the message into the future. And interestingly enough, while this first genetic information, which was an RNA, piece of RNA, while this first piece of genetic information kicked in the metabolism part that was necessary for life, it's interesting how chemistry, which could not have known, actually provided a slate for evolution to occur, right? Because this whole idea of passing on the molecule, if the molecule never got changed, if there was no process, no mutation, no crossing over that occurred later on, none of that, that would have been in the same hereditary molecule passed on and on. It's like the cheetahs, huh? They're all clones. So whatever would have destroyed one of these replicating molecule protocell gizmos would have destroyed them all. But because you could change little pieces of the molecule, change the bases, you could get little different shapes, little different molecules, right? Very, very, very incredible. So, all right, broad brush, right? That's how we think life may have began. We know how to date it. We talked about that several times. So that's where we get these numbers from in the middle. We know, for example, the dinosaurs. Well, this is actually before the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs started about 251 million years ago. So we're going back to 4.6 billion years when the Earth started. Cooled off, wasn't a nice place. Things were pretty slow for a while, remember? And then things picked up very quickly. I didn't spend a lot of time in here. We will talk more about these groups, obviously, as we go through them, right? And we will talk about their evolution again. It's important at this point, though, that I wanted to give you a broad perspective, right? So we start off with, you know, simple critters. Then critters that, right here in the Cambrian explosion, one of the things they developed was the ability to eat each other, right? So that really drives evolution. It's an arms race. And then along came the algae and land colonization, which didn't occur, you know, until after certain organisms could make it on land. Land's really a tough place to live on, okay? More on that later. And boom, here we come in the last 5 minutes of the movie going, hey, what's this about? Reminds me when I was younger, I would do that to my dad. He'd be watching a Marcus Welby or something like that. One of them shows that run back then. I'd walk in and last 15, 20 minutes, I'd be like, why is he saying that, Dad? And he goes, oh my God, I'm not going to tell you why, because you couldn't rewind stuff anyway. Cooper says I do the same thing to him. Oh, well, sorry, Coop. All right, folks. So we come on to the very last minute. Let's get into the details. Of course, I will fill those in later on. Again, kind of a broad brush idea. Life on Earth 3.8 billion years ago, maybe before, give or take a few 100 million years, blah, 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 right? Those kinds of things that started on Earth, those prokaryotes back here, they don't fossilize very well. Although, man, I tell you, they're getting a lot better at processing and finding microscopic fossilized cells and things. So that's really kind of cool. They actually found some microscopic fossilized collagen and protein in a dinosaur fossil. So they found evidence of living proteins, you know, back then, collagen and the protein, right? Why wasn't there life on the early Earth? Well, man, it was, like I said, a pinball gallery, because the Earth, the solar system was just settling down. I don't know how much astronomy you know, but basically the solar system was a spinning mass of dust that begin to coagulate into lumps, those lumps becoming the planets and the asteroid belt and a few other stray pieces of junk out there like comets and other things, right? But anyway, as far as life goes, that means a lot of running into things, big rocks running into things. Remember, it was a big rock that took out the dinosaurs, so it was really hard for life to get a hold. Even if early life didn't know, there were no dogs around Cooper, because this is long before dogs. This is back in the era in which it's just maybe if you're there, you're a single cell prokaryotic, quote unquote, kind of simple critter. And bam, one day you get hit with an asteroid, so you're done, right? It's gone. That's why I said they think maybe life started more than once on Earth before it took hold, and maybe that had something to do with how life was, quote unquote, figuring out, and maybe how Earth was being more conducive. Finally, the Earth begins to settle down so that the prokaryotes can start making a living, and it's interesting among biologists to note that right away evolution's occurring. Right away, we get enough evolution that we very early on, in that very, in the very early stages of life on Earth, already some species or some organisms said, you know what, we're going to live this way. Yeah, well, good for you. We're going to live this way. Archaea, the bacteria. And I'm hoping you're making the connection. The reason why that's happening is because, again, right, what drives evolution? The environment. Think about that. The Earth is changing. It's cooling down. It's becoming not a great place, but at least a little more hospitable. And remember, back then, organisms could live on practically anything, even iron, right? Like this critter here that lives on the iron of the Titanic, what we call chemoautotrophs. They make their own food through a chemical process. Plants are photoautotrophs, right? They make their own food using sunlight. And even if it's not iron, there's lots of organisms that can do this. This is metabolism, folks. When you oxidize something, you release energy, remember? So this is a way to extract energy that organisms use, and lots of these things were around. Even today, lots of that stuff is around. Volcanic activity and plenty of carbon dioxide and hydrogen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, so there's plenty of that around. Plenty of CO2 on Earth, right? Okay, but some organisms would have maybe switched to the light, especially those organisms that lived up near the light. That would have been perhaps a question that an evolutionary biologist would be interested in. Well, something about being a photoautotroph, using sunlight to make your own food, was better and more efficient than being a chemoautotroph, at least in that environment. Remember, that's why we still have chemoautotrophs. Evolution doesn't make organisms perfect, it makes them adapt. Now, we talked about photosynthesis. You remember photosynthesis from Bio 1. It's a little complex, right? So we figured out, and we talked about the fact that parsimonious-wise, simple-wise, we believe that maybe critters were first photosynthetic. So the one on the next slide, click. There we go, right? So the one on the left is more plausible. We said that it probably makes sense that, these chemoautotrophs, these iron eaters, maybe floated somehow into less or shallower water, so there was more sunlight. And for whatever reason, and I'm sure evolutionary biologists could figure out there's some efficiency thing going on, but that environment where there's light, it would have been better to have been a photosynthesizer. Now, later on, heterotrophs, which isn't the same as the guys eating iron, right? They're eating iron. That's some heavy-duty stuff. Heterotrophs just eat things that have already made very digestible energy, food and plants. But later on, it makes sense that some of us, including ourselves, right, would have lost that ability. So that parsimony is important. Doesn't mean it didn't happen the other way. But we do know there were a lot of photosynthesizers, because about 2.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere on Earth became very oxidizing. It switched from that reducing where molecules are being put together, right? In the early Earth, we talked about that, but it switched to an oxidizing one because there were just mats of these things. Remember, stromatolites, this is where the ocean is eroded to these things in the columns, but just think if you had a mat of these fossilized things, and then the ocean, worked its way through, like the river in the Grand Canyon, right? You get the idea. But there were tons of that stuff, and they were making lots of oxygen. First, oxygen turned to iron. Sure it did. Alchemy. Turned to rust, right? It turned to rust, and then there was so much, it's saturation, right? The oxygen bubbles out of the atmosphere. They actually think that's one of the things that caused one of the global climate change. All of this oxygen coming out of the atmosphere, quote unquote, all at once, was good for eukaryotic life. But, for example, some prokaryotes are obligate anaerobes, aren't they? That means oxygen kills them. Remember, oxygen is not good for you. regardless of whether you were on the losing end or the winning end of this whole oxygen revolution, there was a dramatic change 2 billion years ago. It looks like it's saying it began 2.5 in the graph. And then if we think that the result of that, so that's where we get to 1.8 up here. So we're looking at the end of the oxygen revolution, the rise of eukaryotic life. O2 levels are rising. Now, remember back from Bio 1, why O2 levels rising. Well, Cooper's done what a lot of you do in class. He's falling asleep. So I guess he won't be asking any more questions. I can hear him snoring. You might be able to as well. Remember, we talk about geological time occurring fast for that geological frame, but not fast. So O2 levels changed over a period of hundreds of millions of years, but in the end, there was a dramatic change in a relatively short period of time. Obligate anaerobes, they died off. Remember, oxygen's you need oxygen, but it's also killing you. Some of them figured out a way to survive just by chance. There was nobody sitting down at a table. There were no free-living bacteria that eventually became the mitochondria, right? Or there weren't any free-living. Is that the next slide? Yeah, I'll come back to this, right? There weren't any free-living organisms out there that were able to sit down with other cells and say, hey, I got this oxygen thing driving me crazy. Now, if you're looking at the aerobic bacterium, this guy here, which became the mitochondria, right? We think it was a bacterium like one of these. I'm sorry, not that one. That's one of the photosynthesizers. It was a beta bacterium. I thought I had a picture of it. Anyway, it was a bacteria, different critter. Aerobic, you're saying, well, higher oxygen, wouldn't that be great? Well, what if oxygen got too high, right? Goldilocks. So being engulfed, which remember, eukaryotic cells like to do. We like to engage in endocytosis. And not only do we engage in endocytosis, we can also engage in this particular case, receptor-mediated. Remember that from Bio 1? So we can endocytosis-specific things. All right, so these two organelles were perhaps at one time a bacteria. One was the cyanobacteria. Now, cyanobacteria are similar to the cyanobacteria you're seeing in this picture up here on the right. Okay, so the same sort of idea. These are cyanobacteria growing in these huge mats. Now, they're not engulfed in the eukaryotic cell, but if something happened in the past, that would have given these eukaryotic cells, whether you're heterotrophic or photosynthetic, which means you can do both, right? An advantage, right? We know the advantage of having mitochondria. Look at respiration if you've forgotten. And the advantage, a plastid is what became the chloroplast. The advantage of that is obvious, right? So that saves some of them folks. All right, so what's going on here again? The environment is changing relatively rapid, and organisms are adapting, or most of them are dying off, but they're adapting. Eukaryotic cells, because they like to engulf things, in other words, they have a propensity for that endocytosis, very fortuitously, yeah, I said that right, very fortuitously used that to engulf these guys that were like, oh, too much oxygen, these anaerobic prokaryotes, so even if they were aerobic, might have had too much oxygen, but you get inside of a cell, we live endosymbiotically, the eukaryotic cell says, I'll mediate the amount of oxygen you get, right? Slow it down so you get just enough but not too much, et cetera, right? It's all going to be driven by evolution and making an organism more fit. So that's what happened. We think about, oh gosh, I saw a new number the other day, 542 million years ago is now supposed to be the official start of the Cambrian explosion. It's a million years. Anyway, just about 5.5 million years ago. Now think about it, Earth's been around 4.5 million. So it's not till about 4 million years later billion years later, for about 4 billion years, the Earth is just kind of inching along, trying to make life, some simple life, and then boom, the Cambrian explosion, which again, Darwin didn't understand cladogenesis. He didn't understand punctuated equilibrium, right? Darwin's speed of evolution or pace of evolution was gradualism, gradual change through time. Lots of time. We know there's been a lot of time, and gradualism does exist, but in many cases, what we see in diversity is a result of cladogenesis, punctuated equilibrium, just what you see in the chart. Not sponges turning into cnidarians and cnidarians turning into the next group, but at some point branching off, just like the archaea and the bacteria did at the very beginning, right? They both said, well, I'm going more separate ways. So even though to Darwin it looked like it happened very quickly, again, really 25 to 100 million years. Piece of dynamite down there. That's a pretty long fuse. So over 25 to 100 million years, this happened. Now, again, that's I was going to say there's a gap of 75 million years between the lowest and the highest estimate. And that's a lot of time. I get it, but not a geological time, all right? Geological time, that's pretty quick. That's why we call it an explosion. Now, the explosion, again, is if you were digging in the fossil record, when you got to about that time, as you're coming up from deeper, boom, all of a sudden you see all these. And now, interestingly enough, in that first 25 to 100 million years, all the major groups of organisms appeared, okay? Not appeared, but arose. So here's the Cambrian, right? Well, okay, so the Cambrian lasted. Cambrian explosion ended here, but its beginning is back about here. See, before the Cambrian explosion began, see, it's hard to talk about things beginning and ending when they last 100 million years, but nonetheless, the sponges were around and the jellyfish were around, but these other groups that we'll talk about, including ourselves, we belong in this group, we weren't around until the end. So in this period of time, we went from sponges and jellyfish to all of these guys, us, I think really cool stuff called brachiopods, the worms, clams, oysters, insects and their relatives, right? And of course these guys. We'll talk more about that. But see, notice an explosion is really kind of relative. But what do we think was driving this explosion, regardless how long it took? I said it, arms race, right? What was going on during this time was evolution was always going on during this time, and the environment was always dictating how species adapted or didn't adapt. But now we're throwing in predation. Predation was going on during that time, but as we actually start talking about when we get into fish evolution a little later on the semester, the big thing about predation was during this time, somebody out there, not somebody, but lots of somebody's figured out this thing called jaws, okay? Right? Sponges don't have jaws. Jellyfish don't have jaws, but a lot of the rest of them critters there do have jaws. And when you got jaws, it means you got the big weapon in town. So either y'all are going to have to develop jaws or figure out a way to get away from me by hiding or learn fighting or being fast or whatever the case may be. Okay, so we got this major explosion of life, but now that's happening in the water, okay? That's happening in the water. We're not out on land yet. Land, for reasons that I'm sure are obvious to you, and I will repeat a million times until they are obvious, dries you out. Desiccation is a problem on land, okay? So before you move out of water on land, you're going to have to solve that problem first. Now, what plants did, right now, animals did it later too. Animals came on, for example, arthropods, insects, about 500,000 years later. But about 500 million years ago, one of the things that plants do is many plants that lived on the edges, nobody said they jumped right into the middle of the landmass, but they developed this ability to develop waterproof coatings on their leaves, folks. And if you've ever seen a red mangrove here in Florida, or a wax myrtle, if you've never seen a wax myrtle, remind me, I'll take you out on the nature trail and show you one. If you feel the leaves, they have a waxy coating, just like chapstick, and that's to keep water in. Red mangroves and plants in general, right, are always concerned about losing water. Remember, that's why they have that big central vacuole from Bio1. They can't go get water. They got to store it. So if you're moving out on land, that's going to be a big thing. Another thing, land is not particularly rich in nutrients. It's kind of dirt, minerals, and all that's good, but you got to have a source of energy there, right? You got to have a source of food there. So plants, as many species do in different other arenas, folks, they got out on the land with help with something else, something called mycorrhizae. Okay, now mycorrhizae, that's a cool word, is a fungus. So this is a really good example of an extremely beneficial symbiotic relationship, right? Symbiotic. Cooper woke up and he goes, oh, I know symbiotic. That's when I come in and you feed me, and then I go climb on your lap and I make you happy because you pet me, right? It's that symbiotic relationship. So you help me, I'll help you. Mycorrhizae is a fungus that enters into a symbiotic relationship with specifically the roots of plants, those that were trying to make it out onto land. Now, we'll talk more about mycorrhizae later on in the fungus and in the plants, but if you took a root of a plant and you did a cross section to it, so here's the root, and you cut it this way real thin, and you, anyway, it's supposed to be straight. These would, all these arpuscular containing cells, these are mycorrhizae. And the inside, this is the root. So this is the plant. It's almost like a sheath over the outside of that plant. Now, what the mycorrhizae do, because it's a fungus, is they digest things in the land. Now, again, we'll talk more about fungi. Fungi are weird digesters. But anyway, they produce this soup of nutrients. And so the roots from the plants, they don't have to do that initial breakdown. It's kind of like, remember the bacteria that live in the gut of the cow, right, that allow the cow to eat cellulose. It's the same idea here. What do the fungus get from the roots? Well, the roots pass back, for example, carbon materials back to the fungus. Remember, every living thing needs carbon. Every living thing needs carbon. You got to have carbon. That's the central foundational element in atoms, right? So they say, here's some building blocks, fungi, and well, fungi are growing alive. You know, if you went on the field trip with us Friday, I tried to show you some areas where it's growing down in the soil. But again, more on fungus later. But plants moving out on the land could not have colonized land without these mycorrhizae. So, and then in turn, it's like, you're right, it's like I was going to say stair step, but I don't want to imply Aristotle. Not that he was a bad guy, but in this case, it kind of is. Then plants created opportunities for everything else. For example, it created opportunities for things to eat plants, right? The herbivores. It also created, here's symbiotic, opportunities for these guys 500,000 years later, the arthropods, specifically the insects, to really start diversifying. Because when insects moved out on the land, plants said, whoa, I got this really cool thing that can transfer pollen around. So I don't need wind or sometimes water or, just those things, which maybe my pollen gets a good distance. Maybe it falls on the sister next door. Maybe it falls on me, and that's not great. Here come these little insects that move around. As long as I give them this little sweet bit of nectar, they'll pollinate. Now, the insects would have benefited from the nectar, and they would have diversified. And the plants, especially the flowering ones who are real big on pollinators, many of them are, would have benefited from what the insects were doing. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch your back. See how this all fits together? Even though these are broad strokes, it's very reasonable to assume that these things could happen. Okay, but life isn't always moving on the upswing. We recognize 5 mass extinctions. There's a lot of folks that are suggesting we're in the middle of a 6th extinction right now. Doesn't occur, this latest one is not occurring as dramatically as the extinctions previously, but it's basically habitat destruction, habitat modification, and not in a good way, by human beings. That's what we're talking. Deforestation. One of the problems with the Florida panther is having enough land for Florida panthers to survive. But there is, I believe, an interesting part in your book about the 6th extinction. But if not, look up online. It's interesting, compelling information there. But in the past, we look at what has happened as 5 major extinctions. The 2 best one-knowns are the Permian, which is right here. All right, the Permian is the one that ushered in the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs start here. There we go. And then the Cretaceous, and there's the Cretaceous. Cretaceous about 65 million years ago. All right, so the Permian ushered in the dinosaur era. The dinosaurs didn't start right away. It took a while, but between 200 and 250 million years ago, we always think of the Mesozoic as being the dinosaur era. So we could talk about each of these extinctions, but let's take a look at the Permian, this one here, and then the Cretaceous. Now, this was a pretty significant one that hurt back in the Silurian. This is the Silurian. The Silurian had to do with this period, the Carboniferous. A lot of plants were, going crazy during the Carboniferous. So it started producing the oxygen, becoming very, atmosphere became rich in oxygen. And that affected some critters' benefit and some critters it did not. I believe also I read the other day that one of the things we happened during this time was that this is when those oxygen levels came up out of the ocean and maybe just really heavily oxygenated. But cool stuff. But let's go to the Permian. The Permian extinction occurred 250, 245 million years ago, somewhere around then, but it was a big one, right? 90% of all the marine species went extinct. 90%. I'll show you in a minute how that happens. You think, holy cow. About a third of the insects, and it only in 5 million years, right? Now, I know that's a long period of time, but it's not a long period of time, geologically speaking. All right, what was going on? The two biggest things that we think caused this huge extinction during the Permian was a habitat disturbance, a change in habitat. You think, well, isn't that good? Well, yeah, it is for some, but it's not good for some or for others. And in this particular case, it wasn't good for a lot, especially those that were living in the ocean. Remember, evolution started in the ocean. So what was going on, and I'll come back to B in a minute, correct, was this formation of this planet, or this continent, I know you've heard of, not planet, it's on Earth, called Pangaea. And Pangaea is a result of the fact that our Earth is moving. If you take my oceanography class, this is very familiar, right? This is plate tectonics. Plate tectonics says that the Earth is a series of these, like a cracked eggshell that's moving on this semi-liquid mantle, which is molten rock, okay? And these plates run into each other, and they make earthquakes and volcanoes. But the big thing about it, of course, is that means the planets are moving, all right? So if we look back through time, through geological evidence, so we're going from present back to when the dinosaurs started, at the time of the Permian extinction, or at the time when the dinosaurs, which come next, started rising in prominence, all the continents of Earth were combined together in a supercontinent called Pangaea. Pangaea looked maybe a little closer up like that, okay? So they've superimposed where the continents are today. Now, where did the continents come from? Well, they were all a bunch of little continents. So think about a bunch of little tiny land masses. Eventually, what volcanic activity can do underwater is it brings material up. It can build islands, right? So all this volcanoes were going crazy back then, folks. I'll get that in a minute, but it wasn't just like the volcanoes today. So imagine these little bubbling up of land coming up, blip, 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 and through millions of years, they begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger and start growing together. All right, so habitat's changing, okay? Wait, let's go to the next picture first. Habitat's changing. As these continents are sticking together, there's less coastline. Most organisms, and if you took my oceanography class, you know this, most organisms in the ocean aren't in the middle. They're along the coast, right? That's where the nutrients are. That's where the photosynthesizers are. Plants can't photosynthesize 2 miles down where the Titanic is. You got to eat iron, or you got to eat them who eats iron. But most of that is going to be, so if you got a lot of shoreline, surface area to volume ratio. He's like, what is he singing? From Bio 1, right? If you got a lot of little lumps, you got a lot of shoreline. You got a lot of places to hang out and get food. But if all them lumps come together and make a big lump, do the surface area to volume ratio. That's why I was singing that. You got less shoreline. Less shoreline. Great for some species. Not great for a lot. Apparently not great for a lot. 90% of all marine species. Remember I told you how neat that is? What you see today is just the remnants, the 10% that's left behind of this extinction event that occurred 250 million years ago. Okay, now for those that benefit, as there were those who benefited from it, especially those, this is a little foreshadowing, especially those that could live in drier climates, because here's what happens when you form those big continents. It's all wet and fancy along the edges, but we all know in the middle the deserts occur. It's physics, right? When you get big continents, you get deserts in the middle of them, and deserts are drier, and from wet to dry, there's all kinds of things that are really wet or things that are really dry or everywhere in between, right? So if you could move from the dry area and move out wet area, and move into these drier areas and say there was enough to live and you could survive there, you got the house to yourself. You're going to start diversifying, aren't you? And there's a critter out there, not the amphibians. Amphibians always have one leg back in the water, right? Got to go back to the water to lay eggs. But Reptiles. Reptiles can live in dry climates. So this would actually spur on, be a catalyst for reptilian diversity. And what are the reptiles that would have diversified and really went crazy back then? Now, there were already reptiles, but I'm talking because of these new habitats. Yeah, it would have been the dinosaurs that would have done this, right? Now, as we go forward in time through the dinosaur era, the Mesozoic, into today, the continents continue to drift to the way we see that today. So keep that in mind as we go through these periods and these different groups of animals. That's going to raise problems for some, yeah, and opportunities for others. And that's just the way life works. That's the environment in a really grand scale. So during the Pangea, you would have lost a lot of that shoreline, right? The oceans would have deepened. All right. Now, the oceans deepening would have been bad for some and good for others, those that maybe found a way to make a living in the deep ocean. So maybe that's where we got evolution of a lot of our really cool deep water species, right? Inland places become colder, they become drier, they become different. Now, back to the Volcanica thing. That was the second thing that we think was going on in the Permian. I want you to understand what this says in Russian. No, I'm kidding. It is in Russian. It's a Russian map. I couldn't find one in English, but it shows you exactly what I mean too. Back during this volcanic era, we're not talking about volcanoes today where a mountain goes off every once in a while. We're talking about areas, for example, this in the blue. I was going to outline blue with blue. You can see the blue line drawing around. What they're highlighting there, this is a volcanic lake. During this time of this volcanic activity, there were these not just volcanoes going off, but there were these gashes in the earth, right? These, look how big, Russia's huge, right? But there were these just lakes of lava, huge, massive lakes of molten rock, and it was hot and spewing all these nasty gases up into the atmosphere, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, debris that was blocking out the sun. That wasn't good for some critters. I mean, so you see, you get this combination of environments changing, this volcanic activity, which I want you to understand was on a massive scale back then, right? It's not that way now, thank goodness. This is the type of volcanic activity that we believe occurs under Yellowstone, by the way. Yellowstone is sitting on a pool of lava, and if Yellowstone goes off, it won't be like a volcano. It would be this eruption of what's a good word? Like a scab coming off. That's awful. But anyway, you get this massive release of those nasty things. All right, now, whatever that was, that would have caused changes occur, of course, but it didn't cause an extinction. It caused an extinction for a lot, but it didn't cause an extinction for the predecessors of these guys. So the reptiles are already around, but they're kind of just making their way along the shorelines, and all of a sudden you get this. And of course, as I said, look at the jaws there. Jaws, teeth. Oh my God. Take jaws and put teeth in them. Whew. Now you're kicking ass, right? Now you can really eat. Then jaws with teeth, and you armor yourself, you become a triceratops or any of those other ones with the horns. You're a tank, you're a battle wagon. So heck yeah, you rule the world for 200 million years, right? Now the mammals are here, not in that picture actually. The mammals are already evolving. The mammals are evolving about the time the dinosaurs are starting to rise to prominence, but they're little and small, and they come out at night, and they have big eyes because they come out at night, and they're getting their butts kicked. So mammals are pretty much things that crawl. Mammals are that thing between dinosaurs' toes. If they don't move fast enough, they get stepped on, all right? And that probably is the way it would have been up until today. I mean, today, February 5th, 2017. I'm telling you, unless this happened. A rock, an asteroid, a rock, the size of Manhattan. Here it is. You ever been to Manhattan? It's big, right? The size of Manhattan comes out of space and slams into the earth. That map? Yeah, here. Slams it into the earth, we believe, right near where the Yucatan Peninsula is today. So here's Florida in this map in the upper right. That's Chicxulub. It's the Chicxulub crater. Some people out looking for oil discovered it because it's all been eroded, but when they used this special imaging system, they found remnants of a crater a big one. Part of it was on water. It was like this. Part of it was on land. The size of the crater, blah, 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 blah. So that's what the dinosaurs, when they looked up and saw that day, right? Now, this is a big rock that hit the earth. This is what we call a planet killer. Planet killers are rocks that change, they're asteroids that change the planet. In a macabre way, NASA, maybe not NASA, but folks who look at asteroids and dangerous to Earth call them city killers, country killers, and planet killers, depending on the size. You know, one that could come and blow up over Atlanta, that could wipe out Atlanta, and they could. And those many times they do, they explode in the air. This one exploded in the air as well as hit the Earth and peeled away the crust of the Earth like you do on an orange. Wiped out about half of the marine species, right? Many families of those that just got out on land, right? Oh my gosh, you know, and this is in one day, folks. That's what I think is cool. And all the dinosaurs. Didn't all die in that one day, but they eventually died off. Now, the Alvarez theory is very interesting because it's a relatively recent theory. It's a neat piece of detective work. If we dig down in the rock layer to 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs went extinct, that's that right there, we find this very thin black layer of rock. It's actually called the KT boundary. Daniela will appreciate this. The K comes from, in German, Cretaceous starts with a K. So I believe they were German folks who worked on this. Alvarez's weren't German. They were from Berkeley, but I believe that's how the name came around. And T is the next level up, which is the tertiary. So this is the tertiary. This is the Cretaceous. And then this is what we call the KT boundary, that little black layer. Now, what's in that little black? It's all over the Earth. All over no matter where you dig, you find that little black layer. And there's an element in there known as iridium. If you've ever worn Oakley sunglasses, they use iridium for, I don't know, probably to sell it to you because they think it sounds exotic. Iridium is an element, one of the elements on the periodic chart. Rare on Earth, abundant on asteroids. So what we think that black layer is that all that iridium stuff falling back down onto Earth from the asteroid when it hit the Earth. Thin layer all over the planet. Cool stuff, right? Alvarez theory. It's a brother and father team from the University of Berkeley who put this together. Very cool. Okay, so what happens after the dinosaurs? Well, holy cow, man. Then Katie barred the door. All kinds of things happened. Don't freak out. We're going to go through each one of these. As we talk about the groups, but we're ending right here. There's the end of the dinosaurs. And the birds and the mammals. Everything starts radiating, right? And the humans. Make the connection, though, between what's going on here and how the planet's changing. Because as I go through each one of these groups, remember those continents, this is Pangaea. Whoops, sorry, no, this is Pangaea. Here we go. Every time the continents change, they're going to cause habitat change, right? So always keep those those concepts connected. What we mean by an adaptive radiation, then again, was basically as new habitats are formed. Remember the Galapagos finches, Darwin's finches, you find a bunch of different habitats, and that was going on. You get a lot of species go extinct, but you get those who radiate out, or those ancestral species, like this, an ancestral cynodont. An ancestral cynodont is, and I always get this kind of mix. There was a real gradual change from reptile to mammal. So somewhere along the way, there were these cynodonts. I don't know if they're considered a mammal, reptile. Some are even considered mammal-like reptiles. So I'll talk more about that. But anyway, these ancestral species begin to radiate out. And amongst the mammals, about 180 million years ago. So during the dinosaur era, there were already the monotremes, the weird platypus, the opossum and the marsupials, right? Even the placental mammals. There weren't giraffes, there weren't kangaroos, there weren't platypuses, right? But there were monotremes, marsupials, and what we call placental eutherian mammals. But notice, so 65 million years ago would have been right about here. So even though before the dinosaurs went extinct, they were starting to radiate. This is numbers of species, right? Monotremes never really did much. They're an interesting group. But man, I tell you, after the dinosaurs are gone, yay, then the party started. Right? Not only did that occur among animals, occurred among plants. This is an example of adaptive radiation that occurred much more recently. But this is an example of adaptive radiation in, tarweed, that's what this is, a relative of tarweed. Tarweed is a North American relative of these plants. And I don't know how closely North American tarweed is related to these all that occur obviously on the Hawaiian Islands. But what they're trying to show you there is, look at the age. The Hawaiian Islands different in age. The biggest island is younger, 400,000 years, and Kauai is 5.1 million years. Again, if you took my oceanography class, you know why that works. Hawaii is actually a part of the plates that are moving. There's a hot spot underneath it, and every time this plate that the Hawaii sits on is moving this way, and every time it forms over a hot spot, these little lumps are that volcanic material bubbling up. They get smaller as they erode and go. You can trace this all the way up into Siberia. But on that group of islands, or what we call an archipelago, I was going to type it, but I already have because we talked about it with Darwin's finches. On a group, there are all of these closely related species. And what we find out is, as we go from the older island Kauai to the newer island Hawaii, we have certain species that occur on the newer islands and not on the older islands, right? So this one up here in the upper left is going to occur out of here in Molokai and Kauai. This one's on Oahu. That's where Pearl Harbor is, by the way. But this one down here, this is on Hawaii. We know why that is. We can actually follow the spread. Whatever started these groups of similar related plants took a hold first on Kauai, which would be one of the first islands to form, right, as we move the plate. And then the other ones spread from island to island. So it's benches, but with plants. Adaptive radiation. Now, we talked about the timing of evolution, slow and fast and gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. But let's talk about, one of the things combining what we know with some of our recent knowledge about genes and how genes affect things. The specific genes I want to discuss are things called developmental genes. So these are genes that control your development as you're growing as an embryo, growing as a young offspring, And what we mean by they control your growing, they control not only how fast you grow, they control when certain things grow in relation to one another. Like, for example, if you think about it, during the time of puberty, mammals, the sexual organs are going to begin to, if not grow, certainly they're going to mature, right? Females are going to start ovulating and men start producing sperm. Developmental genes are also going to control where things go. So they're going to control the spatial relationship of things, the spatial change of patterns. And I think you'll see in just a minute what I mean by that. But the point is, if we make little changes at how fast or slow something grows, or when or not it starts growing, the timing part, or where we put something, that's kind of poking the devil with a short stick. Little tiny changes in these developmental genes at the beginning can result in very big morphological changes. See what I'm saying? Don't get confused. I'm not talking about changes at a population level and evolution like we're talking about. I'm saying if we make these slight, you can potentially have a very large effect on an organism by making a very small, slight genetic change. You can have a very large effect by killing it, for sure. But if you don't kill it, you might be able to make major changes. So let's look at a couple of these kinds of changes. First, changes that occur to heterochrony. Hetero is other, right? Chrony is time. So we're talking about if things occur at different times. So this is going to involve the rate and the timing. And then something called homeotic genes, which is going to be the spatial pattern. I'll talk more about those in just a second. So let's look at an example of heterochrony. We got two organisms closely related to one another. We're going to look at the skull, relative positioning of the skull bones when they're a fetus versus when they're adults. Much different, right? Nobody would confuse a human adult skull with a chimpanzee's adult skull. They're very different. Much more emphasis on jaws. Certainly a lot more emphasis on teeth. In our case, much more emphasis on the cranial capacity. We're smarter than chimpanzees. But you notice in the human fetus and the chimpanzee fetus, if you look at the spatial relationship, they're relatively similar, aren't they? That's what the square over top. So if we change the timing at which different bones form, like, for example, a bone in us that would grow more length and width in the same degree, so a bone in our head that might grow this way and this way